name's Matt. If we haven't met, I would love to meet you. I am one of the pastors here at Salt. And if you've just joined, I do want to add my welcome and that you're here with us today. But if you've just joined, you've just heard a really weird passage read. And this is one of the things that here at Salt Community Church, we try not to pick and choose what we preach on and what we do. We just want to work through the Bible in all of its messiness and its glory. And we believe that God speaks to us through this to lead us. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. Last week we started in Esther 1 and kind of introduced this series. And you're welcome to, actually I encourage you, jump on to YouTube or Spotify and you can listen to the sermon there. But today we're going to continue in this. Now, after last week's preach through Esther 1, I was informed that there is a movie about Esther, and then since then I've found out there's actually several movies about Esther. So naturally, but at this point, there was just one that was told to me, and I looked it up. It's called One Night with the King. Now, I didn't watch it. I think it's about a 2-hour movie. But I read a few reviews, and I did watch the trailer, which went for about 5 minutes as well, and I think showed me basically the whole movie in those 5 minutes. But essentially, it presented this sweeping love story of a young Jewish orphan girl that rises from obscurity. She enters the palace. She becomes queen when she captures the heart of this powerful king and then saves her people. Like Esther it was like this, what we just read in the story of Esther is telling a rags to riches royal romance. And yet, I'm sure as you were listening just now, there was a few words that jumped out at you that made you realize that that's not what's happening here. You see, we just read about young women who are not invited, but are taken. They're prepared, they're presented, and they're evaluated by this king. And if they're not chosen, they're then set aside. Because this is not a love story. This is a story about the mess that human sin and power makes, where people are used and dignity is ignored and desire takes what it wants. And suddenly, Esther feels far less like a fairy tale and more perhaps like the world that we recognize around us. But here is what makes this chapter here's what makes this chapter so confronting and yet so hopeful. As Harry pointed out earlier, God is at work right here. Not after the mess is cleaned up, not once everything becomes safe and straightforward, but in the middle of all of it. In a broken system, through vulnerable people, amid decisions that are far from ideal. And it raises the question, or it should raise the question for us. Can God really be at work in places like that today? In messy, complicated, uncomfortable parts of our lives? And maybe more personally, is he powerful to work in that space? Why does he allow that space? And then as we think about me, can God still work in me? Not the polished version of me, but the real me with my past and my regrets and my wounds. You see, today we are going to see that God isn't absent from the mess, but sovereignly at work in the mess. But let me pray before we go any further. Heavenly Father, we come to your word with, as Tim has led us before, with open hands, open hearts, open minds. And we ask that you would speak to us, that you would reveal truth to us, God, that if this is a time when we've come and we're not really sure about Christianity or the Bible, God, would you use this time to deepen our understanding? Lord, that we might see a God who is not distant from the mess, who is not ignorant of the mess, who does not abandon us to the mess, but steps into the mess with us. We pray this now in Jesus' mighty name. Amen. Okay, let's step into this story. Now, last week we kind of spent all of our time in the palace, but now we move from the palace as the focus shifts to almost a wide angle lens. It zooms out, and we read in verse 5, now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew. And it's a subtle reminder that in a world of emperors and 7-day banquets, there are ordinary people living their lives. In fact, in this space, it's not a people who are living in excess, it is people now who are living in exile. And we are introduced to this man, this Jewish man, Mordecai, who we read is the son of Jair, son of Shammai, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if again, last week we kind of talked about the history in Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians taking those who were in Jerusalem out and into exile, and this is going back 120-ish years. And so, but it can sound like Mordecai is the one himself who was carried out of exile. This is a little side note here. I just think it's helpful. I found it interesting. But if this was Mordecai who was carried out of Jerusalem, it would make him incredibly old, probably about 120. Now, whilst some argue that that is possible, it's more likely that this is a Hebrew way of locating him within a family line. And now this is going to become important as we go further. And this is why I think this is what it's saying. See, it's saying, at this point, it is saying this is his people's story, his family's story, and therefore it is his story too. It is a story that is marked by loss, by displacement, of people taken from their land now living under foreign rule. And this is where I think it actually deepens, because there's a little mention in here that he is from the line of Kish. Now, for us, that might just sound like a throwaway line. We're like, yep, the Bible's always talking about genealogies. I think we can just move on. But in cultures where ancestry carries deep meaning, my wife and I and our 2 boys, before moving back here to Canada, I spent 5 years living in New Zealand. And we found, particularly among Māori, genealogy tells a bigger, more significant story for people. And it's because it speaks of connection, it speaks of identity, it speaks of memory. And so for the Jewish listener, again, where this ancestry is important, the mention of Kish points to a bigger story. That Mordecai is from the family line of King Saul, which is an interesting thread to pull on as we consider the silent hand of God at work behind the scenes to bring about his purpose. Now, I don't think the author gives us this detail by accident. Because if you know the story of King Saul, you know the story of David, and you know there was a point where King Saul became jealous of David and he pursues David to kill him. Now, there was a moment, actually, there was a couple moments where David had the opportunity to kill Saul. I mean, as I've said, he was being hunted, he was chased and threatened. Humanly speaking, David had every reason to justify, humanly, taking Saul's life if ever he had the opportunity, and he had to. And yet, we read, and we'll see in 1 Samuel, David says, I will not lay my hand on the Lord's anointed. Again, potential throwaway line here, but what we're seeing is that he chooses reverence over revenge. He chooses faithfulness over opportunity. And Saul lives, his line continues, and generations later, Mordecai is here. And you can't help but wonder what acts of quiet faithfulness in one generation ripple further than we can ever see or imagine. Because as this chapter unfolds, we're going to see that the same kind of quiet faithfulness shows up again, and yet this time it is through Saul's descendant, Mordecai. But first, let's look at verse 7. Again, I encourage you to follow through with me through your handouts or in your Bibles if you have one. And we meet Hadassah, or as we're told, that is Esther, who Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother had died. So we see this orphan who is taken into this family, and the connection between them is that they are cousins. But before that, we're actually told a really specific detail, that she had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Now, why are we told this? Again, remember, this isn't a love story. So this isn't to romanticize her, but because we're being told this, because this is exactly what the king, Xerxes, is looking for. Because in this kingdom, this detail will determine her future. Because in this world that she is living in, beauty is not simply something to be appreciated. It is something that will be assessed. It is something that will be selected. It is something that will be used. See, because we then read in verse 8 that the king's order goes out to gather all the young virgins, to the beautiful ones. Now, interesting word, gathered. It can kind of sound nice, but let's call it what it is. They're taken. They're not asked. They're not given an opportunity to refuse. They are extracted at force. And Esther is one of them. And from there, the process begins. Not because they want to, but because they have to. 12 months of their lives dedicated to beauty treatments, to preparation, to presentation, to performance. And then one night with the king. And we kind of go through these details because after that, we then see that if the woman doesn't please him, if she pleases him, she may be chosen. But if not, she is placed into another house, set aside, but not free to return home. So not chosen, but not released. And all of this can read so simply and so neatly on the page, and yet it's not neat. It's not simple. This isn't neutral. It's not harmless. We need to be really clear when we're reading this. This is systematic. This is efficient. This is deeply, deeply broken and it should be devastatingly confronting. Something in us should recoil as we read these words because this is not right. But it's into that feeling that this is not right. I just want to ask, why? Why do we instinctively say that this is wrong? Now, some people might say, well, it's obvious. This is wrong. We know today as 21st century enlightened people that this is wrong. And we've come to this conclusion because humans have just gradually worked this out over time. But history, even today's present age, would suggest otherwise. You see, humans don't naturally drift toward the dignity of all. More often, we drift toward the dignity of our people, my tribe, my class, my race, my gender, my side. And when we look at the ancient world, they certainly didn't assume that all human life had equal worth. Persia didn't, Babylonians didn't, Rome didn't, Greece didn't. You see, in these contexts, the strong ruled, the weak served, power decided, and its way was the only way. So why do we feel that this is wrong? This is where I want to say, whether we admit it or not, the Bible, this Judeo-Christian worldview that we read, that begins in Genesis 1, when we read that every person, male, female, has been made in the image of God. The moral imagination of the Western world has been shaped by the Bible. You see, the Bible presents that whether you are male or female, whether you are strong or weak, whether you are powerless or powerful, whether you are Jew or Gentile, whether you are slave or free, whatever your skin color, whatever language you speak, all bear dignity. All are accountable to God. All unable to be reduced, to be belittled, to be diminished, to usefulness, to beauty, to status or strength. And yet, alongside that truth, that every person is made in the image of God and therefore holds inherent dignity, the Bible also exposes a pattern that begins in the beginning, in the garden, where we read that Eve saw the fruit and that it was good and pleasing to the eye, and so she took it and she ate it. And then from there, the pattern repeats. In Genesis 6, we read this strange story about the sons of God who saw the daughters of humans, that they were beautiful, and so they took any that they chose and married them. And then it shows up again among God's own people, Abram and Sarai, who were impatient with God's timing. They desired a child, and they see their slave Hagar, and they take her to fulfill their purposes. And then again with the now King David, the same one who spared the life of Saul, we read a story where he, in his position of power, is on his roof, and he looks down over the rooftops and he sees the woman Bathsheba, and he desires her and he takes her. Do you see this pattern of seeing, desiring, and taking? Seeing, desiring, and taking. In all of these examples that I've just laid out to you, this pattern brings harm and disorder and eventually death. And now we see it here again with King Xerxes, seeing, desiring, and taking. Now, interestingly, just on Wednesday last week, as we've mentioned and prayed for, taste and see, we talked about what is the question that we looked at, the big overarching question of talk 2 is, what's gone wrong? What's wrong in the world? And I think we see it here in its rawest form. We see sin, where we see, we desire, and we take. In other words, we decide what is good and what is right for me. It doesn't matter what others say, and it certainly doesn't matter what God says. Because I have now put my place in the position of God. See, it's not always kings, but it's those who think that we know best, whether it's in secret or whether it's out loud. Because if we're honest, this pattern isn't just there for Bible stories, for kings. It lives in each one of us. Whenever we use people instead of love them, whenever we pursue what we want without regard for others, whenever our desires override dignity, we echo the same pattern that we are seeing here in Esther 2. However, if we step back for a moment, we notice another pattern. Because you may have noticed that I have mentioned David twice now. Once when he saw, desired, and took. And if you know the story, it leads to death and destruction. But before that, when he had the opportunity to take life, he chooses faithfulness to God instead. And this leads to life. Can you see the two contrasting patterns? There is a way of life that grasps, that takes, that consumes, and it leads to death. And there is a way of living that trusts, that restrains, that honors God. And this leads to life. And this is the choice that sits before all of humanity, all throughout time, and for you and me again and again, every day, not just once, not always in the big moments, but every single day, even in the little moments. Again, as I've said, soon we'll see Mordecai quietly steps into that second way. But before we get to Mordecai at the gate, we need to look again at Esther in the palace. As Harry helpfully mentioned before, that God has never named, and yet we see his fingerprints everywhere. We see with Esther's story this young woman who had very little control In fact, some could argue no control, taken into a system that she did not choose. And I want to be really clear, we should not ever sanitize this. The Bible doesn't hide behind sensibilities and prettiness. It gives us the raw reality of humanity. And God stepping in to draw us, to call us, to redeem and restore us. And as we see this story unfolding in Esther, we see that it is messy, it is uncomfortable, because it is shaped by human sin. And yet the text keeps telling us something that we might almost miss in amongst all the other mess. And we start in verse 9 where we read that Esther finds favor. First with Haggai, who immediately provides for her and advances her to the best place in the harem. And now sure, we might think that still doesn't sound great. For that moment, this is favor. And in verse 13, we read that anything she wanted was given to her. Then in verse 15, Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. Before finally reading in verse 17 that even the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Now I want to be really clear here that favor here does not mean the situation is good, that it is right, that it is clean. It means that God is opening doors inside a situation that is not good, that is not clean, that is not right. And so I want to acknowledge that there is a significant tension here. Because on one hand, everything about this situation is completely and utterly broken. And yet, on the other hand, something is quietly unfolding. And we will see this over the weeks to come. But again, the tension doesn't stop there. If you look at verse 20, we read that Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality a secret, just as Mordecai had told her to do. Now, sure, we can read this and go, yeah, a form of deception would be fine. Consider the context, Matt. But then, aren't we trying to say that Christians should be honest, truthful, people who follow God, live lives of integrity? Now, the text doesn't stop to explain what's happening here, but it also doesn't condemn it. It simply tells us what happened. Because again, this is Esther takes us into a historical story that is not neat, that is not tidy. It's not a story of perfect faith. This is life in exile, where God's people are navigating a world not shaped by Him, where decisions are not always simple, where faithfulness can feel complicated and confusing. See, Esther isn't standing boldly and publicly declaring who she is, who her people are. She is waiting. She's navigating. She's discerning. She's surviving. And yet, even here, God is at work. There is a tension. And so the question isn't, is this a nice story? No, we know the answer to that. This is not a nice story. The question is, can God really be at work in something like this? Not after it's cleaned up, but right here in the middle of the mess. And the answer that Esther begins to whisper is yes. Even here, God is not absent. Even in what we've prayed about today with these stories of illness and diagnosis of cancer and death, God is not absent. He is not approving of the evil. He doesn't delight in pain and suffering, but neither will He or is He stopped by it. Through His people, in His timing, according to His purpose, He is working. And the question is, will we trust? Will we trust? Or will we just go and hope and luck? Because I think Esther here is saying that this is not random coincidence. This is not random luck, but the quiet providence of God. God working through ordinary events, ordinary decisions, ordinary conversations, ordinary timing to bring about his purpose. And as if to really hammer this home, we then read in verse 21, it's almost like a side story, that Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate. Just sitting, waiting, and he just happens, coincidentally, to overhear a plot. 2 officials planning to assassinate the king. Now, is this coincidence? I would suggest no. But what this is a decision point. It is a fork in the road for Mordecai to choose what pattern he will follow. You see, this is the king who takes what he wants, a king who uses people, a king who abuses his power, a king whose kingdom is time and time again marked by injustice. And here is an opportunity for Mordecai to stay quiet, to stay silent, to let things just take their course. An opportunity perhaps for justice to be served and for this evil man to be brought down. So what should Mordecai do? What would you do? Well, for Mordecai, the 2 choices, the way of taking, the pattern of taking says, let Xerxes fall. But the way of faithfulness says, I will do what is right before God. And we read that Mordecai speaks. He reports the plot, and the king is saved. And just like that, life is preserved. Not because the king deserves it, but because Mordecai chooses faithfulness in a messy situation. Can you see and feel the pattern that is there? The 2 patterns, the 2 ways, one way that leads to death and one way that leads to life. Mordecai quietly steps into that second way. And this is where you would expect big events and a big concert for him, like a whole bunch of celebration. But what happens? We read, it is written down in the royal records, and then nothing. No reward, no recognition, no thanks from the king. I wonder if you've ever felt like that. You're sitting here thinking, man, I'm trying to live a faithful life. I'm trying to honor God and revere him in my life. And yet, time and time again, it seems to go unnoticed. I'm doing the right thing, and yet I am constantly being overlooked. I'm serving, and yet never thanked. Utterly unseen. I mentioned earlier a story about Abram and Sarai and the slave that they used. The slave's name was Hagar. She was a woman who was caught up in someone else's decision, used to fulfill their desires, and then cast aside. And if you read the story, we'll have a little bit of the story here in Genesis. When everything unravels, she finds herself alone in the wilderness and on the brink of death. Unseen, forgotten. And yet, it's there that she encounters God. And her response is that you are the God who sees me. Do you see what is happening here? Humans, when we step into the place of God, we use it to take, to serve our need, our desires. And yet God, when he sees, he moves toward those who are hurting, towards the orphans, towards those who are in need. That same God is at work here in Esther, unseen, unannounced, but not absent. God sees Hagar, God sees Esther, God sees Mordecai, and God sees you. God sees what others miss, what kings and others forget. God does not. Because Esther 2 doesn't just show us a broken king and a broken world. A world where sin seems to set the agenda, where power takes, where the vulnerable suffer, and where at times it feels like evil is winning and there is nothing we can do to stop it. Esther shows us these things, and when we see a world like that, when we begin to realize that this is also reflected in the world around us, we don't just long for a different kind of power, we don't just long for a change, we long for a different kind of king that can usher in a new world. A world that stands, a king that stands above the mess. A king that doesn't stand above the mess, but enters into it. A king who will not use the vulnerable, but will give himself for them. A king that is ultimately revealed in Jesus. Because this is how we see most clearly that God is at work in the mess. When God comes in the person of Jesus, not remaining distant, but drawing near. We read in the New Testament where Paul says that Jesus, though in very nature God, did not use equality with God to his own advantage. He made himself nothing, taking the nature of a servant. Jesus lives the faithful pattern perfectly, trusting the Father, restraining himself from grasping, honoring God all the way to the cross. Why? Because Jesus did not come to grasp life for himself, but to give life to us. See, where we read in Esther 2 that Xerxes takes, this is so clearly contrasted when Jesus gives. When Xerxes uses power for himself, Jesus uses his divine power over all things. We're told that all of creation is found in him, sustained in him, comes from him, and yet he uses that power to serve humanity. Where Xerxes gathers women, takes them for his pleasure, Jesus welcomes people with dignity, with love. Where Xerxes is saved by someone he doesn't even acknowledge, Jesus saves by giving his own life for all who are trapped in this pattern of life, of seeing, of desiring, and of taking. And in this is the wonder of the gospel, of the good news of Jesus. Often we can look at the world around us and we think we are people who are trapped, who are living in this broken system, and failing to see that we are people who contribute to this system. And yet, the true King does not discard us, does not say, I'm done with these people who continually reject me. No, he steps into the mess and gives himself. And this means something, it should mean something deeply personal for us. And it is embodied in our act of celebrating communion together. Because at this table, we don't come to take what is not ours. We come to receive what Christ has given freely. His body given for us, his blood poured out for the forgiveness of sins. See, this table tells us that Jesus did not stand at a distance from the mess, but entered into it, bears it, and takes our sin upon himself and invites us and gives us new life. Now, perhaps you're here and you're not yet trusting Jesus. You're still exploring what you believe. I just want to say, we're so glad you're here. And I hope some of what I'm saying is ringing a little bit true for some of you. And I just want to invite you to take this moment to just sit and to reflect and to simply ask, what kind of king, what kind of God gives himself like this? But for those who are trusting in Jesus today, this meal, this representation of a meal is for you. Not because your life is neat, or your past is clean, or because your faith feels impressive and perfect. In fact, it's here for the complete opposite of reasons. Because Christ has given himself for us, for sinners, for sufferers, for the weak. And so as you come to collect the bread and the juice, again, just so you know, the bread is gluten-free. Come remembering this, that in Christ you are seen, you are known, and you are redeemed. You are not defined by the sin you have done, and you are not disqualified by the sin that has been done to you. You are invited, welcomed into a different way of living. So when you're ready, come and receive these elements and then bring them back to your seat. And once everyone's seated, I'll lead us in eating and drinking together.